There's a fundamental distinction that Mooji makes in this teaching that I think deserves careful examination. This separation between what can be known conceptually and what can only be experienced directly as being itself. It's a distinction that has deep roots in contemplative traditions across cultures, and it points to something important about the nature of consciousness and its relationship to conceptual understanding. Mooji begins by discussing this concept of receding, this gesture of pulling back from complete identification with perceptual and conceptual content. He's suggesting not that we destroy or eliminate perception, but that we recognize a fundamental difference between the perceiver and what is perceived. Perceive but don't purchase from it, as he puts it. Be aware of what appears in consciousness without immediately combining with or identifying with it. What's particularly interesting about this approach is how it differs from our ordinary relationship with experience. Most of us move through life in a state of constant identification with the contents of consciousness, with our thoughts, perceptions, emotions, and sensations. We don't merely observe these phenomena, we become them in our experience. I am angry, rather than I notice anger arising. I am my thoughts, rather than I am aware of thinking. Mooji is pointing to the possibility of a different relationship with experience, one where we maintain a kind of witnessing presence that doesn't immediately collapse into identification with what is witnessed. But this isn't about destroying or eliminating the contents of consciousness, but about recognizing that consciousness itself is distinct from its contents. He uses the metaphor of a kaleidoscope, which I think is quite apt. When you first look through a kaleidoscope, there's often an immediate reaction, a woe of fascination or overwhelm at the constantly shifting patterns. But if you continue to look, something interesting happens. You begin to notice that while the patterns are constantly changing, the awareness observing these changes remains constant. There's a stillness at the center of the experience that isn't affected by the kaleidoscopic movements. This points to something fundamental about consciousness that's often overlooked in our ordinary experience. We tend to identify completely with the changing contents of awareness, with our thoughts, perceptions, sensations, and emotions. But there's another aspect of our experience that isn't changing, the awareness itself, in which all these phenomena appear and disappear. Mooji asks a crucial question. That which sees both the action and the reaction, what is its action or reaction? He's pointing to the witnessing awareness itself and asking about its nature. Does this awareness have qualities like the phenomena it observes? Does it have a shape, a front and back, a location in space? Or is it more accurately described as stillness itself, as the space or context in which all experience occurs? This distinction between awareness itself and the contents of awareness has been recognized across contemplative traditions, though it's described in different terms. In Buddhist traditions, it might be discussed in terms of emptiness or Buddha nature. In Advaita Vedanta, it's often referred to as the self or pure consciousness. In more contemporary terms, we might simply call it the witnessing capacity of consciousness, the ability to observe experience without being completely identified with what is observed. What makes this distinction particularly challenging to grasp is that it can't be understood conceptually in the same way we understand objects or ideas. As Mooji says, this you cannot know, you can only be. He's pointing to the limitations of conceptual understanding. When it comes to recognizing the nature of awareness itself, you can't observe awareness as an object because it's the very observing itself. You can't conceptualize it because it's the space in which concepts appear. This isn't to say that conceptual understanding has no value. Clearly, concepts are essential for navigating practical aspects of life and for communicating with others. But Mooji is suggesting that there's a dimension of our experience that transcends conceptual understanding, that can only be recognized directly, not grasped as an object of knowledge. He describes a process of receding from identification with perceptual and conceptual content, but he notes that this receding is only the beginning. At a certain point, something shifts. The projection outward to look at things and even the reaction to them becomes external, and something is left. It just is. This is the recognition of what was there all the time, but was covered by the functioning of what he calls the chooser identity. What's particularly interesting about this description is that it doesn't involve destroying or eliminating anything. The world doesn't disappear. Your hands, your tongue, your brain, they're all still there. But your relationship with them fundamentally changes. You recognize that while these phenomena appear in your experience, they aren't what you fundamentally are. You are the awareness in which they appear, not the appearances themselves. Mooji suggests that this recognition brings a profound peace, not because external circumstances have changed, but because your identification has shifted from the changing contents of experience to the unchanging awareness in which experience occurs. This peace isn't something that needs to be created or achieved. It's already present as the fundamental nature of awareness itself. It's only our identification with changing phenomena that obscures this recognition. When asked about what this recognition feels like, the questioner describes it as more and more devotion, more and more love, more and more peace, more and more joy of the absence of personal identity. Mooji responds by saying, "These are your perfume," suggesting that these qualities naturally emerge from the recognition of your true nature, like a fragrance emanating from a flower. They're not something you need to cultivate or develop. They're the natural expression of awareness when it's not completely identified with conceptual and perceptual content. What's particularly valuable about Mooji's approach is that it doesn't require adopting specific beliefs or engaging in complex practices. It's simply about recognizing something that's already present in your experience, the awareness in which all phenomena appear. This recognition doesn't depend on religious faith, philosophical agreement, or even spiritual inclination. It's available to anyone who's willing to look directly at the nature of their own experience. Of course, this doesn't mean the recognition is easy or immediate. Our habitual patterns of identification are deeply ingrained, reinforced by language, culture, and years of conditioning. The tendency to identify with the contents of consciousness rather than consciousness itself is so automatic that it can seem impossible to recognize anything beyond it. This is why Mooji uses metaphors and pointers rather than direct explanations. He's not trying to give you something you don't have or take you somewhere you aren't already. He's inviting you to notice something about your experience that's already present but habitually overlooked, the awareness in which all experience occurs. He uses the metaphor of two mirrors facing each other to point to what cannot be seen or known conceptually. When two mirrors face each other, they create an infinite regression of reflections, a visual representation of something that transcends ordinary perception. Similarly, the nature of awareness itself transcends what can be grasped through ordinary conceptual understanding. What Mooji is pointing to isn't a philosophy or religion, but a direct recognition of something fundamental about consciousness itself. It's not about accumulating knowledge, but about recognizing the context in which all knowledge appears. As he says, more knowledge you can have, but more emptiness not. Knowledge operates within the field of consciousness, But consciousness itself, the emptiness he refers to, isn't an object of knowledge. It's the space in which knowledge appears. This perspective has profound implications for how we understand ourselves and our experience. If we're not fundamentally our thoughts, emotions, sensations, or perceptions, if we're the awareness in which these phenomena appear, then our identity isn't defined or limited by any particular content of consciousness. We're not ultimately defined by our personal history, our characteristics, our achievements or failures. These all appear in awareness, but awareness itself transcends all particular content. This doesn't mean that the relative aspects of our experience, our bodies, relationships, work, and so on, are unimportant or unreal. They're real within their own domain, but they're not what we fundamentally are. Recognizing this doesn't diminish their relative importance, but places them in a larger context, the context of awareness itself, which isn't defined or limited by any particular content. What Mooji is offering isn't a new belief system or philosophy, but an invitation to recognize something about the nature of consciousness that's already present in your experience. It's not about achieving a special state or having a particular kind of experience. It's about recognizing the awareness that's already present, within which all states and experiences appear. This recognition doesn't require changing anything about your external circumstances or even about the contents of your consciousness. It's simply a shift in identification, from complete absorption in the contents of consciousness to recognition of the awareness in which these contents appear. This shift doesn't eliminate thoughts, emotions, sensations, or perceptions. It simply changes your relationship with them. The peace, love, and joy that the questioner describes aren't qualities that need to be cultivated or achieved. They're the natural expression of awareness when it's not completely identified with changing phenomena. They're already present as the fundamental nature of consciousness itself, only obscured by our habitual identification with the changing contents of experience. In this sense, what Mooji is pointing to isn't something esoteric or separate from ordinary experience. It's the most immediate and intimate aspect of experience, the awareness in which all experience occurs. It's not something you need to reach or attain, it's what you already are prior to any identification with particular contents of consciousness. The invitation is simply to recognize this, not as a new belief or concept, but as a direct recognition of the nature of awareness itself. This recognition isn't something that can be grasped conceptually, because concepts appear within awareness. Awareness itself isn't a concept. As Mooji says, this you cannot know, you can only be.